Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation from the previous lesson of the third chapter of Proverbs. We earlier did a lesson, we made it up to the 18th verse, so you can type in Corey Johnston, Proverbs 3, 1 through 18, and we explained the literary context in that, so you'll have to type in that to get the fuller foundation, but we're actually just going to read verbatim without commentary on verses 13. This lesson begins in verse 19, but the connection of wisdom is really started in verse 13, which reads, "Blessed is the man who has found wisdom, and the man who gets understanding, for the gain from it is better than the gain from silver, and its increase than fine gold. She is more precious than rubies, and all your delights are not comparable to her. Length of days is in her hand, riches and esteem in her left hand. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree to life to those those taking hold of her, and blessed are all who retain here." Now, verse 19, this speaks, the antecedent verses very much speak of human wisdom, whereas verse 19, of which we're soon going to read and commentate on, are divine wisdom. Now, there's a qualitative chasm which exists between man and divinity, and that he is infinite in all his attributes, where we are finite. We can only reflect the attributes he radiates, and we're to study his perfections and attributes to reflect them in our finite ways that we can. Now, verse 19 reads, "Yahweh founded the earth by wisdom. He established the heavens by understanding." So all the universe and earth that was brought into being was not an arbitrary or accidental cosmic conjoining of matter. The prime mover of matter was an invisible and immaterial being who brought it all into existence. He spoke it into existence. And it's really an act of wisdom. Now, the process of creation demands a creator who was omnipotent. He was powerful enough to bring it into execution and maintain it after he brought it into execution. Omniscient, it all unfolds according to a wise and perfect design. Intelligent design is the school of thought, which is more or less interchangeable with creation. And it's really, it shows the remarkable wisdom that he could do this all. It's really unfathomable to humanity. We often ponder at the origins, but this is the most plausible explanation, that a completely perfect being brought all that is in existence into knowing, and it was a very much an act of wisdom and understanding. And we can read in the 8th proverb, where the process of wisdom and creation are expounded more extensively and fully. "By his knowledge the depths were broken up, and clouds dropped down dew. My son, let them not depart from your eyes. Watch over sound wisdom and discretion." So this is a return to human wisdom. Now, Solomon was with the exception of Joshua, he was the single wisest man in all of history. You can read of the extent of his wisdom in the Book of Kings and in the Book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Now, there are divided scholarly schools of thought which classify the Book of Song of Solomon in wisdom literature. Now, the Song of Solomon is very much love. It's a sappy love emotion, but the school of thought which argues that it belongs in the category of wisdom literature insists that it is very much a wise way of life to be sappy and sentimental with one's loved one, and to while publicly speaking and presenting acts of wisdom, in private it is very much commensurate with wisdom to love and have that love reciprocated, because that builds the sturdy foundation of a home. If you don't love your wife, you're not going to have a solid foundation for family. Then they became life to your being and an adorning on your neck. This brings us back to earlier in the chapter. We read that he's essentially to make something part of his being. physical analogies for intellectual, which is by its nature invisible, but he uses the physical, which is known, to express what is unknown or unseen. Wisdom is, of course, known by its very nature, so I may have erred, honest mistake in there. Then you would walk safely in your ways, and your foot would not stumble. Now, verse 6, we read, acknowledge him in all thy ways, and he will guide thy paths, just to reiterate something. Now, when we deviate from his path, he's not obligated anymore to guide us. So the guidance is conditioning on the antecedent in the verse, which is to acknowledge him in all his ways. When you lie down, you need not be afraid, and you shall lie down, and your sleep shall be sweet. Now, this is faith and fear cannot simultaneously coexist in the same person at the same time. They are very much antithetical. Yet, we are repeatedly throughout Scripture admonished to fear the Almighty, and this is a faithful fear. Now, the fear of Yahweh is the fear that expels all other fears. We can read of that. One verse which immediately comes to mind is Exodus 20:20, which elaborates on the fear which expels all fear. So really, when we're told to fear the Almighty, the only thing we really have to fear is fear itself. Do not be afraid of sudden death, nor the ruin of the wicked when it comes. For Yahweh is at your side, and he shall guard your foot from being caught. Do not withhold good from those who deserve it, when it is in the power of your hand to do so. Now this reminds us of a New Testament passage, Luke 3:11, when his Roman soldier inquirers are asking them, what must we do to be righteous? And he says, if you have 2 tunics, give one to one who has not. So if you do have an excess of material items, there's no sense in hoarding it from one who doesn't have anything. So generosity is very, very much a virtue, and it's synonymous with charity. And then the next passage reminds us of another New Testament passage in James 2. I cannot locate the exact numbers, but that's something worth looking up. And it reads, do not say to your neighbor, go and come back, and tomorrow I give it, when you have it with you. So there's really no excuse when you have the item in your hand to withhold it from him who needs it more than you. Do not plan evil against your neighbor, seeing he dwells safely beside you. Now, neighborly love is a principle throughout the Scriptures. Leviticus 19:18 reads, love your neighbor as yourself. And I actually wrote a book on the meaning of neighborly love, which I don't have by my side. I have prepared for it in other discourses, but you can purchase it on most major online outlets. It's Who is My Neighbor, an extensive commentary on the Good Samaritan parable, where the Savior really brings the meaning of neighborly love, which had been restricted by his time by exalting a Samaritan as the embodiment of male love. And long story short, there was, by the dawn of the Common Era, there was centuries-long mutual antagonism between the Jews and the Samaritans. The Samaritans were the, long story short, when the northern king of Israel was captured by their Assyrians, their conquest policy for subjugation differed from the Babylonians, which conquered the Judeans, in that the Judeans concentrated them all in the capital city, which preserved their ethnic homogeny, whereas the Samaritans interbred and intermixed the captive people, because the idea being that ethnically homogeneous people would be more inclined to rebel, whereas they were watered down and diluted genetically. They would have no semblance for national unity. But that's ultimately distracting from the substance of the passage, so we're going to return there. Do not strive with a man without cause, if he has done thee no harm. Now, this is essentially saying never argue for argument's sake. Now, there are certainly places for argument. It's just to say never assume the aggressive initiative in an argument. So, when someone challenges our faith, we're duty bound to defend it. This is the field of apologetics, and that is very much a righteous argument. And there's even a place for argument of a friendly disposition between us and the faith in non-essential doctrines. Now, on all matters essential, there should be unity. In all non-essential doctrinal differences, there should be tolerance, but in all matters, love. So our arguments between those of the faith should be guided always, always by love, whereas there is such a thing as a hostile argument. And strive is not limited to argument. It could be more violent confrontation, not necessarily the verbal confrontation. But Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 3:8, there is a time for peace and a time for war. Now, this may seem to contradict the principle in Matthew 5:39 of turning the other cheek, but as I see it, Solomon was a king, and while that the Savior's principle is valid on an individual level, for it is better spiritually to endure suffering than to inflict it, as a king or a leader in responsibility, it is neither wise nor warranted to inflict harm on the people under your jurisdiction and protection that you could have prevented. For the perverse one is an abomination to Yahweh, and his secret counsel is with the straight. So this is the antithetical, which is one of the main formats of Proverbs. They contrast the ways and the outlooks and the outcomes and the discrepancies between them. The wicked and the just, the lazy and the diligent, etc., etc. And they always implicitly admonish one to choose the wiser course of action. The wise and the foolish is another frequent antithetical juxtaposition, which we find frequently in Proverbs. It is wisdom literature, so it's oriented towards the accumulation and the application of wisdom, because wisdom accumulated is in itself useless if we don't apply it. So, the curse of Yahweh is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the home of the righteous. Now, again, the Proverbs are principles, not promises. Very often, curses come from not necessarily inflicted by Yahweh, but from humanity, because wickedness often prosper at the expense of the righteousness, and being righteous ultimately often subjects you to be vulnerable or taken advantage of by more unscrupulous men. And he certainly scoffs at the scoffer, but he gives grace to the humble. Now he exalts the humble and humbles the exalted. This is in Luke 14:11 and 18:14, as well as somewhere Matthew 23:12. And scoffer is a skeptic, a naysayer, a cynic, anything interchangeable with that or synonymous with it. The wise inherit esteem, but the fools are bearing away shame. So this is another antithetical juxtaposition. Wisdom leads to splendor or esteem. Most Bibles translate this as glory, but that is in fact rooted in etymologically rooted. It is carries connotation with sun worship, not S-O-N, but S-U-N. So this translation avoids that, as do I. But fools, invariably, the path of the foolish leads to shame. Now, fools by their very nature may not be ashamed of their foolishness, which only makes them all the more foolish, but eventually it does catch up to them. So, in the final analysis of this chapter of Proverbs and the book of the whole, the path of the fool is a dead-end trap, and it may seem to bring gain or pleasure or temporary, fleetingly so, but the path of wisdom is always, always better. And that concludes today's message. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye bye.